Warning: this video contains talk of suicide, gun violence, and images some may consider disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not about the shooters or a timeline of all that went on during the attack. This is one victim's story and what she went through. When people intentionally take lives, we often wonder about who they are and what they went through and what led them to do such horrible acts. But the people, in my opinion, who deserve the majority of the attention are the victims. They are the ones that we should remember, their stories that we should share, and the acts of bravery and heroism, and not only the people that died, but those that survived. So today I'll be talking about Kacey Ruegsegger Johnson and the Columbine High School massacre. This is SOSAD, Stories of Survival and Death, a series where I talk about the people in horrific situations, their lives, and how they either survived or died in that situation. So if that interests you, please like and subscribe, and let's get into today's video. Kacey Ruegsegger was born March 29th, 1982 to Greg and Darcy Ruegsegger. She's the second of 4 children. She has older brother Brian and 2 younger siblings, Brittany and Brett. She grew up with the nickname of Lacey Casey, and she describes her childhood as idyllic and carefree, and she was a very timid child. And so her parents got her into sports as a way to socialize, but she didn't really care for team sports that much. So they got her a horse and got her into horse riding, and she also enjoyed gymnastics as well. She enjoyed these solo sports. But when it came time to choose between gymnastics and horse riding, she quickly chose horse riding. Kacey went from winning 4-H competitions to competing in American Quarter Horse Association events, and by her freshman year of high school, she was competing on a national level. Although she was still shy, she was more confident around other people, and she met her best friend Lindsay through it. And she was also heavily involved in her church youth group, and so that gave her another outlet for socialization and another way to make friends and be around other people. She attended Bear Creek High School in Colorado her freshman and sophomore years, and over that time she started making friends in the popular athletic crowd, and she met a boy named Mark, and Mark became her best guy friend. And though they had this mutual attraction for each other, they were never in a relationship. They just kept it as friends. With this new group of friends, though, Kacey started to develop that angsty teenager attitude of rebellion and secrecy, and she started spending less time with her family and more time with her friends. But this is typical teenager behavior. You know, she's finding her identity. She's discovering who she is outside of her family. Then on March 8th, 1998, Kacey got the news that Mark had committed suicide the night before. And this was completely devastating to her. And then just a few weeks later, Mark's best friend Luke also committed suicide. And she was also close with Luke. And so just the feelings of anguish and anger at the death of 2 friends, 2 close friends, to suicide was just unbearable for her. And after Luke's funeral, she decided that she could no longer live with that pain, and she made a plan to permanently escape it. Her parents had been seeing the changes in her over this time, and so they noticed this darker, more worrisome shift, and they dragged her to a suicide counselor, but the visit only infuriated Kacey and solidified her plan. And that next Tuesday, she skipped school with a friend and made a plan for a time, a date, and a method. This friend was also friends with Kacey's best friend, Lindsay, and he told her of Kacey's plan. So Lindsay called Kacey's parents and informed them. Greg and Darcy, in a panic, called the counselor, and he told them that they needed to act like parents. So they pulled Kacey out of school. They had her sleep on a mattress on their bedroom floor. They revoked her phone privileges. She wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone, and she even had to leave the bathroom door open. Kacey resisted this for a long time, as anyone would, but she later recognized that they took control when she couldn't. After 6 weeks, Kacey was finally ready to talk and work through her grief, and she immediately felt the depression just lifted from her. And she began to look forward to things in life again, particularly with her church youth group and horse riding. She lost another friend to some health complications soon after, and her parents were really worried that this would send her back into a deep depression. But she was in a much better place mentally and handled her grief in a much healthier way. Kacey wanted a fresh start for her junior year of high school, so she requested to go to Columbine High School, where Lindsay went. At Columbine, she focused on her education, her equestrian career, and hanging out with Lindsay. And every lunch period, they would go home to Kacey's house for sandwiches and cookies. On April 18th, 1999, Kacey won her second all-around championship of the season and was well on her way to representing Colorado in the World Championships that August. 2 days later, Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, Kacey got up and went to school. The day started off like any other day, but when lunchtime came, she waited at her locker for Lindsay so that they could go to her house for lunch, but Lindsay didn't show up. So after a few minutes, she went looking for Lindsay, but she still couldn't find her. And realizing that she didn't have enough time to go home and back, she decided to sit in the library for the remainder of the lunch hour. This was the first time Kacey had ever been in the library. So she picked up a gossip magazine and sat by the wall of windows to sit and read and enjoy the really nice day. As she sat there reading, she heard a pop, pop, pop coming from outside. And she looked outside of the windows, but she didn't see anything. So she went back to reading. A younger boy entered the library looking for a place to sit, and Kacey noticed him, and so she called him over and offered the seat next to her, and so he sat down and they quietly read next to each other for a few minutes. Suddenly, a teacher came running into the library with a phone in her hand, and she yelled for everyone to get down on the floor, get under the tables, and hide because there was a boy outside with a gun. Then there was another popping sound coming from inside of the school, just outside of the library. And Kacey got up in a panic and she ran over to the computer desk and hid under in a cubicle there where it was surrounded on three sides by a particle board. And she grabbed a chair and brought it over to hide her exposed right side. The boy who was sitting next to her didn't seem to know what to do, so Kacey yelled for him to get under a table, and he picked a spot 2 seats away from Kacey and sat in the partition there. And Kacey worried for him because he didn't have a chair. For some reason, the chair seemed really important to Kacey to have for hiding and some sort of protection, and she just was so worried because he didn't have that. Kacey sat curled up under the desk. Her heart was pounding. She was terrified, and she couldn't really see anything outside of her partition that well. So she was listening for any sound that would indicate what was going on around her. And when the teacher, who was on the phone with 911, yelled again for everyone to hide and get under the table, Kacey noticed that she was bleeding from her shoulder. Then a shot entered the library and everyone instantly went silent. Kacey could sense the shooter's presence. There was just this dark, evil energy in the room. Then one of them yelled for everyone to get up, that this was their day to die, and that they were going to blow the whole library up, and for everyone with a white hat to get up. The jocks, or popular athletes, wore white hats. The shooters were calm, commanding, and laughing and joking about. They were on a power trip and loving every second of it. Everyone remained quiet and unmoving, so the shooters started shooting random shots and throwing pipe bombs around the room, and they hit a computer about 5 feet away from Kacey, and she saw her life flash before her eyes like a photo album. The boys began to walk around the room, and Kacey could hear them shooting, but she never looked to see if the shots met their target. Kacey then felt a hand grab her firmly on her back, and she was stunned because there was no way anyone could fit in this cubicle with her. So she turned to look over her left shoulder, and as suspected, no one was there. But she could still feel the pressure of that hand, and the hand seemed to be giving her a message. She didn't know if she would live or die, but she knew that she was going to be shot. The hand also came with a feeling of peace, of acceptance, of comfort. One of the shooters walked past her, dropped his trench coat on the ground, and she heard the thud of a large gun being set down on the table next to her. And the other shooter was standing by the wall of windows right next to the chair that she had been reading on. Kacey looked over her right shoulder to see them, and the boy that had passed by her was next to the chair, crouching, pointing a gun at the boy who had been sitting beside her. She quickly turned her head, covered her ears, and then heard the shot that killed 14-year-old Stephen Curnow. And Kacey knew she was next, so she raised her shoulders with her fingers still plugging her ears and braced herself. She again heard the gunshot and felt herself being thrown forward. Everything was moving in slow motion, and she saw her right arm fly out in front of her. She hit her head on the side of the cubicle, and the air was knocked out of her. Her exhale came out as a groan, and one of the shooters yelled at her to quit your bitching. Kacey knew that she needed them to believe she was dead, so she pretended to be. And they continued around the room, spewing insults and racial slurs and shooting other students. When she felt safe to do so, she opened her eyes to assess herself. The bullet had gone through her shoulder, through her right shoulder, grazed across her right thumb and her neck, and struck her other hand that had been plugging her other ear. She had a huge hole in her shoulder, and she could feel the muscles around it tightening and restricting movement, making it impossible for her to move her arm. And her right thumb was also gushing blood. Another student asked if she was alive, and she answered yes. Her throat felt like it was closing up, and she saw the pool of blood that was collecting from her wounds, and she used her finger to gauge its depth, and it came up to about the first knuckle. The shooters left the library, and soon after a boy came out from under the tables and yelled, "Let's go!" Kacey couldn't get up on her own, so she called for somebody to come help her. And the boy that had yelled for everyone to evacuate, 16-year-old Craig Scott, came over and he helped her up, and he stood on her left side and supported her right arm with his other hand, and they started to head out. And along the way, some of the other students were looking for other rooms to dart into, but Craig stopped them and told them, "No, we need to get out of the building. Let's get out. The exit was chaotic, and Craig lost his grip on Kacey and soon was lost in the crowd. So Kacey braced her shoulder with her left hand and followed a group behind a nearby police car. Male students were taking off their shirts and using them to stop bleeding, and a girl from Kacey's youth group held a shirt to her shoulder, but she didn't even recognize Kacey. A police officer came and grabbed Kacey and another injured girl and had them in the back of his car. He took them a short distance, had them get out, and they hid behind a shed. And he came back about 5 minutes later and picked them up and then took them a short distance to a nearby neighborhood where they had set up a triage area. Kacey was in fight or flight, so the adrenaline kept her clear-headed, awake, and pain-free at this time. At the triage area, a man asked if there was anyone that he could call, and Kacey gave him her mom's number. And when her mom asked to speak to her, Kacey declined because she knew that she would just break down if she talked to her mom. But the man told her mother that she couldn't talk, and this sent the message that Kacey was either unconscious or worse. A nurse looked at Kacey and told her that she was going straight to surgery, and Kacey asked if she was going to lose her arm, but the nurse just repeated, "You'll be going straight to surgery." An ambulance came, and as they loaded her onto it, she lost a shoe, and she asked them to grab it for her, but they didn't. And on the ride to the hospital, she started to feel the pain. The adrenaline was wearing off. So she asked if she could have something for the pain, but they told her that she would get that at the hospital and that they needed to cut away her clothes so that they could see if she had any other more serious injuries. When she got to the hospital, they took her in for x-rays, and then her parents showed up. And when she saw her dad for the first time, she asked him if he could see the hole in her shoulder, which he could. And then officers came to talk to Kacey. Since they were still in an active shooter status, they wanted to know what the shooters looked like, how many there were, where they went, kind of get some sort of timeline from multiple victims. And Kacey's mom, Darcy, was really angry because she felt Kacey should be getting medical attention, not being interrogated by officers. But the medical team were still waiting on images and tests to be run because there were concerns that her brachial artery had been hit and concern about her lungs and their condition. Lindsay came to the hospital and was struggling with feelings of guilt. She had stayed home from school that day sick and wished that she had sent Kacey a page to let her know that she wouldn't be there, because if she had, then Kacey would have gone home for lunch and wouldn't have even been in the library. Obviously, it's not her fault, but it's a normal reaction. And later they found out that if Lindsay had sent a page or been at school that day, they would have been in the direct path of the shooters as they left the school anyway. Kacey was heavily medicated at this point, so she doesn't really remember much about the rest of the day. But after all the tests were done and she was okayed for surgery, as they were willing her back, her family was able to say a quick goodbye. She had lost so much blood that they didn't know if she was going to make it. And she was in surgery for 3 to 4 hours to stabilize her, clean the wounds, and assess the damage. The bones in her right shoulder were completely shattered and beyond repair, and they didn't know what they could do about it. The bones in her hand, her right hand, were also shattered, but they knew that they could address that. And they were surprised that she didn't have any neuromuscular damage with the extent of her injuries. They were pretty sure that she would live at this point, but they also thought that she would have to have her right arm amputated. None of the doctors there had the skill set that would allow them any other option. So they consulted with other surgeons around the nation about what could be done about it, and a Denver orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Ross Wilkins, who specialized in limb preservation, thought to use a cadaver bone to replace her lost bone. Because Kacey had missing skin, muscle, and other tissue in the area, they knew that she wouldn't be able to regain full function of her arm, but at least with this replacement, called an allograft, she'd be able to retain her nerve function and keep her arm. The damaged tissue wouldn't heal to metal or other implants. Dr. Wilkins arrived at the hospital on the 22nd, and he explained the options to Kacey, and because her tendons and muscles were shrinking rapidly, a decision needed to be made quickly on whether she would try to preserve the limb or amputate. They decided to go with the allograft, and after another surgery to debride the wound and clear her of infection risk, she was secretly transferred to Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Denver, where Dr. Wilkins performed her 6-hour surgery on April 22nd. The event had huge media coverage. At the time, this wasn't another school shooting or a school shooting. This was the school shooting. And even still today, high school shootings like this are referred to as being another Columbine. While she was at the hospital, news reporters were flocked outside waiting to get the inside scoop, and celebrities came to visit the victims. Kacey met with pro athletes and the members of NSYNC. Her hospital stay lasted for 2 weeks, and then she was released to go home. The school offered the students of Columbine to end the year with their current grade, and since Kacey's grades were good, she accepted the offer. And Kacey knew that the girl she was before the shooting was gone. Nothing would ever be the same or normal again. She developed PTSD and became irrationally scared of all men. The only man she trusted was her father. She wouldn't allow male nurses to care for her, and she felt like she was a target for all violence. The 2 shooters, who were seniors at the high school, committed suicide in the library after their assault, but there were rumors of another shooter, and Kacey was terrified that he would come back to finish the job. She became suspicious of everyone and everything. When her brother Brian came to visit 2 months later from college, Kacey accused him of planning to come and kill them all. Kacey knew this was irrational, but just those feelings of fear and paranoia overcame her rationality. Kacey was asked to return to the library to give police a visual of her story. They didn't believe that she could have been shot from behind, since typically exit wounds are bigger than entry wounds, but she felt vindicated when she recounted the details and they knew that she was telling the truth about what happened. Not that they thought that she was lying, but how our brain processes trauma, it's not always accurate what we remember to what actually happened. She and her family were offered to watch the infamous basement tapes, which are basically vlogs that the shooters made before the shooting. And after seeing them, Kacey realized that the shooters became exactly what they wanted to become and caused exactly what they wanted to cause, although they didn't cause as much destruction as they planned to. This was actually supposed to be more of a bombing, and they failed in that, but they still achieved their goal. Kacey didn't want to give them that power, but it would take almost 15 years for her to get that power back. She concentrated on getting back on her horse and competing again, and she was frustrated that her injuries were holding her back, but she was determined to live a life that those boys didn't want her to have. She was cleared to compete in non-riding parts of competition and won in the showmanship category in August of 1999. Not wanting to return to Columbine for her senior year, she instead attended Denver Christian, where every classroom had at least 2 exits. She would suffer from anxiety attacks, but the other students and the school was all very welcoming and understanding, and she eventually started joking about her injuries with other students. If one of the athletes was complaining about how their shoulder hurt one day, she'd give them crap about it. And joking around was just a good coping mechanism for her. In August of 2000, she represented Colorado in the American Quarter Horse World Show in 4 events. And even though she didn't win in any of the events, she knew that she and her horse had given it their all, and she was really proud of herself. And after this, she was ready to close this chapter of her life and move on to a new one. She decided to go to college, pursuing a nursing degree. And while she was there, she met Patrick Johnson when he started attending her college church group. And when she first saw him, she knew right away that he was the one. And though she was still really shy and reserved, she made it a point to go and talk to him and make herself known. And he soon fell for her. And Patrick has been really good for her PTSD. He's a very calm and comforting person. He would help work through what was going on with her, and he would make sure that she felt safe. Libraries were especially triggering for Kacey, and whenever she did need to go study in a library, Patrick would go with her, and he would go in ahead of her and find her a safe place to study with 2 exits nearby, and then he would sit nearby while she studied and just be there with her, and it made her feel safe, and it eased her back into that kind of setting. Kacey graduated with her nursing degree in December of 2004, and then she and Patrick were married on May 14th, 2005. They've had their issues like any other couple, and her PTSD has played a role in their dynamic, but their goal isn't to have a perfect relationship. Their love for each other, compassion, and willingness to compromise and sacrifice for each other has kept them strong. Kacey worked in the oncology ward of the Littleton Adventist Hospital, and she found that she was able to connect with many of the patients because of her trauma and physical disabilities. But after 2.5 years, she found that the physical demands of the job began to take their toll on her shoulder. It began to get more painful and more difficult to do the things that she needed to do. And so after consulting with Dr. Wilkins again, he advised that she give up her profession. And this was yet again another thing that was taken away from her by these shooters. She felt her identity being stripped away from her and struggled to find purpose in the world. Kacey always wanted to be a mother, and eventually Patrick agreed to add children to their family. And children brought back that purpose that Kacey desperately needed. And now she and Patrick have 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Kacey's had a really hard time letting her children attend school, and she's very particular with the schools that they attend. She said, "When the unthinkable happens, it is no longer unthinkable. It becomes what's expected instead." She's thought heavily about homeschooling them, but she didn't feel like that was in their best interest, and she wants them to have as normal of a childhood as possible. After the Sandy Hook shooting, she had severe panic attacks and anxiety. She had to fight her way through the flashbacks and prevent herself from returning to the state she was in right after Columbine. But she knows she can't let fear control her, and she can't protect her children from everything. So she chooses to concentrate on what she can control, and that's what she calls filling their love buckets. She teaches them good coping mechanisms and supports them emotionally, making sure that they feel loved, valued, understood, and accepted. She's required more surgeries on her shoulder throughout the years due to her nursing career, caring for infants, and just use throughout the years, and more recently had to have a replacement done. And she lives in near constant pain. Though she still has moments of anger, she chooses not to feed that anger by wallowing in it. She feels it's not productive in her life, and that doing so gives power back to the shooters, and she refuses to give them any power over her. Though Kacey still doesn't want attention or recognition, she believes that it's important to bring something good out of tragedy. She clings to her faith and feels that God has led her on this path to be a support and advocate for others, and she recognizes that her story is a story of hope and inspiration for others. She's become a spokesperson for Allosource, which is the company that supplied her allograft, and is an advocate for tissue donation, because even though the allograft didn't save her life, it greatly improved the quality of her life. It gave her her arm to be able to hold on to her children and hold their hands and give them a big hug. She's also part of this club that no one signs up for. She and other survivors go around and give support and advice to other mass shooting survivors, and many of them have become public, motivational, and youth speakers, most notably Craig Scott and Austin Eubanks. Craig, who was the one who assisted Kacey out of the library that day, he focuses on his sister Rachel, who was the first victim killed at Columbine, and he spreads her message of love and compassion. Austin spoke about addiction and recovery, but sadly he had a relapse and passed away from a drug overdose in 2019. Kacey has written a book called Over My Shoulder. The information from this video came from that book. So obviously you're going to get so much more of an extensive personal story of her journey if you read that book. So I highly recommend that. Kacey also has a Google Talk that I will link in the description down below if you want to listen to that as well. She is such a kind-hearted, loving, understanding person, and her approach to dealing with trauma and loss is inspiring. Though I will say, I don't think we should think less of people who cope in less healthy ways. We all handle things differently and cope with them to the best of our abilities. And just because someone turns to drug or alcohol or is bitter or angry about what happened doesn't mean that they don't deserve compassion or understanding. So I recommend listening to their stories as well, and don't hold everyone to the same standard for recovery. Also, I think we sometimes aren't very considerate to victims' families or survivors. We kind of expect them to be open and honest with their story and to tell us everything. We feel like we are owed their story, and that's not true. The media is always reaching out to these survivors. Whenever another mass shooting happens, they always go to the Columbine survivors to get their opinions and to get their thoughts on it. And that can just be really traumatizing to some of these people. That's not really fair to get their opinion on a different event. Even though they're similar events, it doesn't mean we're entitled to know their thoughts on it. So I think we should just be considerate to victims and survivors and their families, and just if they want to share, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. But anyway, that's all I have for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.